Uh-oh.
So, pardon?
You have to know how to work technology.
Okay, so here's the deal. When the first class, when my technology wasn't working, I really didn't introduce myself to you, and I apologize. My name is Charles Ellison. You can find my contact information on Blackboard under the instructor box to the left from the main page, and also you can get me through course messages. The other thing that I often say to students that I've not said to you so far is, if you're having problems with the course, or even if you think you might start to have problems with the course, please contact me. My favorite thing in life is not giving students low grades. On the other hand, I'm not a miracle worker. I don't have any magic wands. Once the you-know-what hits the fan, I'm not picking it up. So if you begin to have difficulties, or you have a lot of questions, or even a few questions, please contact me. The earlier the better. Do not think that because I'm some muckety-muck college professor you can't get a hold of me, or oh, it's going to be embarrassing for you or anything like that. That is not a way to think about your schoolwork. And it's not a way to think about your relationships with your instructors. So I want to briefly kind of summarize some of the important points from last time, finish this presentation, maybe I'll be able to start on the next one. So I'm not behind schedule in any event. One of the things I started out with was the idea that governmental institutions and policies may in fact shape political behavior as much as, or even more than, the other way around. And so again, that in terms of the textbook, it's organized from the perspective that political behavior shapes the institutions and policies. It also works the other way. And we talked about power and the importance of power and power relationships in political life. And I provided you some definition of politics that's pretty expansive. And I want to give you an example that I'm sure you'll be able to identify with. I have a nephew who lived in Lawrence, Kansas. He's now a PhD student at the University of Texas in Austin. But when he was in a public school in Lawrence, Kansas, he wore a T-shirt to school one day, and I guess the assistant principal or whoever thought that the T-shirt contained a drug reference, which it did not. But they thought that it did, so they threw him out of school. That was not only an act of power involving a relationship between the school administration and my nephew, but it was also, parenthetically, an abuse of power. But the point is that power, in an expansive view of politics, even that, you keep in mind we're talking about a public school, which is a governmental body, which is funded by tax dollars. And so even that seemingly very individual and personal thing, which of course happens a lot in our country, probably every day in one way or another, is in fact an example of the politics of power as I would define it. So I tend to have an expansive definition of politics, and as we suggested, one of the major issues in politics is how expansive or how narrow the definition of politics should be. Similarly, one of the major issues in politics is about the scope of government, how broad or how narrow it should be, and what the balance of, and there are political disagreements as well that are at the heart of politics about the appropriate balance between issues that are public and those that should be private. So I want to pick up today, if there are no comments or questions, with the rest of this presentation. I'll probably have time to start a second one from Chapter 2. So you should be, when you get your textbooks, you should at least read the first 2 chapters based on where we are right now. So I want to talk a bit about American democracy still in this introductory presentation. I think it's fair to say that over the course of American history, which is now almost 225 years, at least from the ratification of the Constitution, there's been a historical expansion of democracy. And there are ways that you can measure that in terms of, say, some very obvious ways. The constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. It's basic, not even 100 years old yet, I don't think, or very close to 100. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, its extension in subsequent administrations. But two, as the society becomes more politically democratic and maybe even culturally democratic as well, there's pushback. And by pushback, what I mean is there are social groups, political parties, political organizations that are opposed to the expansion of democracy in the United States. And it's important to keep in mind the context historically when we talk about democracy. Democracy has not been historically seen as a desirable thing. The Founding Fathers were not small d Democrats. They did not believe in democracy. We'll talk more about that later. Democracy in the 18th century was a dirty word. Democracy in the 19th century was a dirty word, for the most part. It was not seen as a desirable value for social and political life. And I would argue even today, most of the political systems on the planet are not democratic in any meaningful way. In the United States, we tend to describe what we have as a representative democracy. And over the last, I'm going to say, more than 250 years, one of the fundamental questions in political thought is about what the democratic ideal is. And one of the issues at the heart of this question is what political equality means. And among other definitions of democracy, it would seem to me that the idea that democracy involves a political system in which people are politically equal is the ideal. The reality of all societies is that people are not politically equal, and so one of the questions democratic theorists have asked, usually when I use the term democratic, I'm talking about small d, not the Democratic Party. If I do talk about the Democratic Party, I'll say capital D. Otherwise, I'm just talking about democracy as a political system. One of the fundamental questions that democratic theorists have asked is how much inequality can there be in a society and still be consistent with democracy? So rather than a society of political equals, it may be more realistic to say that a democracy or a democratic ideal is one where there's a modest amount of political inequality, such that obviously, part of democracy, one would think, and political equality would be each person's vote counts the same. And that each person has a relatively equal opportunity to have a say in the political process. In fact, that's not the case, but one can limit the inequality. And between people in this regard. Comments or questions? Okay, so some of the principles that we tend to associate with democratic governments, and again, I mean small d democratic, even though it's capitalized here, is universal suffrage. That is, all adults get to vote and have voting rights. Majority rule. You have votes, and whether it's an election or whether it's in a representative body like a Congress or a Parliament, and whoever has the most votes, their law passes, their bill becomes law. On the other hand, also part of democratic principles is the protection of minority rights. And not only in our country, but in many countries, the question of whether or not minority rights are protected is a major one and is often a source of political conflict. In the United States, unlike some other countries, we have a constitutional democracy. And why is the term constitutional in there? It's there because, first of all, not all governments that claim to be representative democracies have constitutions. But what a constitution is necessarily, in its very essence, it seems to me, is a limit to government and a limit to government power. You've got a document where things are written down. Okay, what is a dictator? What is a tyrant? A tyrant or a dictator is one who basically does anything he or she wants and makes it the law of the land. And of course, people can change their wants very quickly, and so the law, in a sense, is arbitrary. The idea of a constitution is to lay out in black and white what governments can and cannot do. Now, doesn't mean that political leaders necessarily follow a constitution or what it says, but to the degree that they do, to the degree that political leaders, our political leaders, acknowledge the Constitution in the terms of both the way it allocates power and enables government to do things, and also limits power. That is part of what a constitutional democracy is all about. This is hard. Any comments so far? Political scientists, American political scientists, have developed various theories of American democracy. Why do they do that? They want to ask and understand, they want to ask the question, just what kind of democracy is the United States of America? And so political scientists have developed various theories about what democracy in the United States looks like, what it is. These theories are broad, and they provide a framework then for the analysis of the specifics regarding American political life. The first one I'll talk about very briefly is just majoritarianism or anti-majoritarianism. Majoritarianism is the idea that basically majority rules in the political system and throughout the political system. Anti-majoritarianism is just the reverse. It's that majorities should almost never rule. And in fact, what I'm going to argue when we talk about the Constitution is that the framers were very worried about majoritarianism. And they created, in my judgment, a political system that where not only could majorities not rule, but that it would be almost impossible for them to form. I know this runs against almost everything that is conventionally thought of about American politics, but I will go into it in greater detail in the subsequent classes. But I would argue very strongly that, in fact, it is very hard in our system for majorities to form, let alone for majorities to rule. And I would give you as one piece of evidence that in almost no election does a majority even vote. In fact, normally, the only time there's a majority of voters, eligible voters voting, is a presidential election. So political scientists have then, after World War II, began to develop a theory of pluralism. And the idea behind pluralism basically is this. They said, individuals are not the basis of American political life anymore. I know that in the textbooks, long ago it says individuals can do this and make a difference and so on and so forth. And it's not that individuals are unimportant, but the pluralist theorists argued that American democracy is essentially become, as our society's gotten larger, greater population, more organization, that groups really organize political life, and that groups are the key component of American political life. Their argument about that, it essentially parallels what the argument used to be about individuals in their participation in politics. The argument goes something like this. America is a pluralist democracy, and it is because many, many, many groups of all kinds can organize to participate in politics. They all respect the rules of the political process, and they compete, and sometimes they compromise and agree and work together. And anybody can organize a group, and sometimes a group will win, and other times a group will lose on issues. No single group, no combination of groups dominates the political process or political outcomes, and therefore pluralist theorists argued that everybody who organizes a group gets some kind of representation. My favorite example of this, even though I don't really hold to this view because I think this view has weaknesses, but we'll talk about that another time, or you'll read it in the text. My favorite example is the tobacco industry and cigarettes. For a long time, cigarettes were sold, in fact still are probably, I don't know, I don't smoke, with a label. And that label on it says, on a pack of cigarettes says, something that's hazardous for your health. If you're pregnant, you shouldn't smoke. It can cause all kinds of health problems, etc. Okay, where does this come from? It comes from the fact that there's good scientific and medical research that says smoking causes cancer and all kinds of other health problems. Okay? At the very same time that the federal government was mandating that language on packs of cigarettes, the Congress of the United States was providing subsidies to the tobacco industry. How do you understand this? This is craziness. And I would say that's pluralist democracy at its finest or worst. Every group that's organized and is able to organize effectively gets representation. Comments on any of this so far? Or questions? Understand, I am not advocating for any of these views. I'm simply trying to explain the various theories of American democracy that political scientists have developed over time. In response to pluralist theory, Thomas Dye and C. Wright Mills, among others, developed what's called elite theory. And this really starts from some work in sociology. And there are two different arguments, two different perspectives in elite theory. The first perspective says, duh, of course elites dominate American political life. Elites dominate political life everywhere. What's the big deal? And the wonderful thing about elites in the United States, some political scientists argue, is that these elites have democratic values, unlike many of the American people. And thus, when they make policy decisions in government, they do so with the well-being and security of the American people in mind. The other group of elite theorists says, come on, you got to be kidding me. What are you smoking? Elites, yes, they govern, but they govern more in their own interest than in the interest of the people. They may say they may articulate democratic values, but in practice, what they do is something very different. Corporatist theory tries to merge these two perspectives, that is, pluralism and elite theory, and says, yes, we have pluralism, but it's a pluralism of elites. And that various highly organized, well-resourced groups from different parts of the country, different parts of the society, different parts of the economy, in fact, govern more often than not. And so the corporatist theories focus on elites and their power, especially with respect to elites from whose major resources, political resources, are in economic power. And a radical view of American politics, there are boatloads of these. One argues that the economy and the structure of the economy greatly shapes the nature of American political life in ways that are fundamentally non-democratic. And so these different views are out there. And what's important to note is, and this is one of my biases, when I teach American politics, when I think about American politics, I try, and sometimes it's very hard, but I try to act as though every political official, every government official has a bag over his head or her head. And I do that because I don't want to let personal matters like whether or not you make your own English muffins get in the way of a broader understanding of American political life. Comments or questions at this point? It's important to keep these different theories in mind because which one you identify with or find most persuasive will shape the way you think about American politics. This is the part of the lecture I really don't like. I'm going to skip over it very quickly. Folks who talk about American politics think that conservatism and liberalism are basically what define our political universe. I've listed here what conservative values are alleged to be. I've listed here what liberal values are alleged to be. The text talks about these. I will say you should read about these in the text. You should understand what they mean, but I think that these are labels that really don't describe American political thought or practice very well. In part, it's because there are huge differences among those who are conservatives about what they mean by conservative. And there are huge differences among liberals about what liberalism means. So to try, I can't say to you conservatism is a coherent body of thought. I can't say to you that liberalism is a coherent body of thought. Both have a long history, but both are now, in a sense, to some degree detached from that history and so diverse internally that I find it not too useful to think about politics as basically defined between liberalism and conservatism. Any comments? So these are terms I'm sure you've heard before. Do you have any questions? Look at the slide. I mean, it's not that these descriptions are inaccurate as far as they go, but I'm not sure how far they go, in part because of the differences within each. Socialism is a little clearer. Clearly, there's socialist ideology is one that offers strong support for economic and social, not just political equality, and social. Any garden variety of socialist belief advocates government ownership of the country's most essential industries and/or employee cooperatives in those industries. If I were going to give you an example, I would give you the transportation industry, especially airlines and trains, as being sectors where there could be government ownership and where it would seem to me that the industries are both not very good. I think that's an understatement. And one might even argue that, you know, what's the the interstate highway system, established in 1956, I believe, under President Eisenhower. I mean, that is a huge underwriting of transportation in the United States, auto transportation and truck transportation. Libertarian views tend to offer strong support for property rights. They tend to oppose regulation. This isn't worded quite right. They oppose social programs for less advantaged and middle-class people. They tend to be hostile toward government activities pretty much across the board, and want very, very, very limited government. Comments? One other thing that we can say about liberalism and conservatism is I've already suggested they're overused and of limited use, but people tend to associate the former with the Democratic Party and the latter with the Republican Party. And it seems to me the most one can say is that Democrats tend to be more liberal or less conservative than Republicans. And the question is, should these or do these two parties or two ideologies define the political universe, or should they? And so, for an answer to that question, I'm going to rely on a little video clip, if this works. Hang on, I'm going to need to. It's not what I want to do. Oh, it's going to make me do this. Hang on a second.
I don't know why, John.
Yeah, but you're not wearing the chat box.
Hang on, I'll be right back with you.
I've never chatted in a chat box before.
Have you ever typed a message?
Yes, it has. Yes, it has every morning. When you join us, I thought it was really good. Okay. I may have trouble with this, so I can tell the wrong one. You bring up the video.
Okay. Let's see if this works. Hang on a second. Can you see the screen? Hello? Hello? Okay. Okay. Did you see the video?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's Alicia Silverstone, or whatever her name is, in Clueless. And her last statement is "as if." And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, at least from my point of view, liberalism and conservatism, as well as Democrat and Republican, to define American political discourse and practice solely in those terms is a bit narrow, because there are a lot of other political views, philosophies out there that that might also be important. Okay, so I think this might be the last. Yeah, this might be the last slide for the Chapter 1 lecture. And going forward, this is what I'd like to suggest to you: that the framers were interested in developing a limited government that was both fragmented and inefficient. I'm going to give you a clue that almost nobody else will say, or does say, which is, everyone whines about the inefficiency of the government. You know whose fault that is? It's the framers' fault, or responsibility, because they designed it to be inefficient. And one of the things I'm going to argue when we talk about the Constitution and the federal system is they wanted government to be inefficient because they already knew efficient government, okay? It was called King George III, and they had enough of King George III. They knew what efficient government was. Efficient government was autocratic, authoritarian government. They weren't about that. They were against that. And so the government that the framers designed was deliberately inefficient, however, not as inefficient as our first government, as we shall also see. So some of the things that make American government inefficient are, which doesn't, and we Americans tend to think that efficiency is a good positive value. Efficiency and democracy do not work together. That may be the only thing that Dick Cheney ever said that was right. Democracy is messy. Democracy is inefficient. So they provided for, as we'll talk about in the next presentation, separation of powers, checks and balances, and federalism. All of these, both in theory and in practice, fragment governmental power. So we have a system, we have a political system, not only at the national level, but at all levels, that deliberately fragments government. And so, from my point of view, one of the fundamental conditions and problems of American government is that we have a fragmented government on the one hand versus a corporate economy with very concentrated power and wealth on the other. And so in a fight, or in a conflict, or in a disagreement between a fragmented entity and a very concentrated, powerful entity, who's going to win? Well, the fragmented entity is not going to win most of the time. This is the same thing with an army. If your resources are fragmented, if your leadership is fragmented, it's very hard to fight off a concentrated, powerful, well-resourced opponent. Any comments? Whoops. One more. most American government texts, including this one, talk about the importance of political consensus. And that American society, American political life has been characterized as one with high levels of consensus. It seems to me that while that may be comparatively true to compared to many other countries, we are now living through a period of greater political polarization and division, as well as political gridlock. There are plenty of folks out there in American political life who now hold the view that political compromise is an evil thing. And the framers held just the opposite view, as we shall see when we talk about the Constitution in the next presentation. They saw it as absolutely necessary and essential to the functioning of our political process. Okay, so let's see what happens. Any comments at this point? Lacey, do you have anything to say while I'm searching for this other thing? Are you there?
Hi. Yeah. No. I just noticed that we had 5 students that were able to get logged in to Blackboard, and I just wanted to make sure that there weren't any questions on getting their account set up, if anybody was having any trouble. So to hear you, I'm going to need you to step close to the mic.
Come step up to the mic.
Step up to the mic.
Come on, don't be shy. Step up to the mic. We've got one.
Okay. What's going on?
I punched in my C number and it told me that there was an error and it wouldn't let me log in.
Okay. Do you remember what the error was? Did it just not recognize your C number?
Yeah, it said it wasn't recognizing it.
Okay. So when you got that error message, did you back out and try it again?
Yeah.
Okay, and it still gave you that message?
Yep.
Okay. Can you tell me your name and give me a way to contact you, email or phone?
Haley.
Haley?
Yep.
What was your last name, hon?
Elliot.
Okay. And what's the best way to reach you? Do you have a cell number or an email?
My phone is 812.
Okay.
972. 4826.
486?
26.
Okay. I will work on that today, Haley.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
I'm ready. I'm ready. I got 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Any comments or questions before we move on to the Constitution? Okay. Got a couple more minutes, and then we'll call it a morning. I think I'm going to skip my other image, but you should look at it. So when thinking about the Constitution, it's important to keep in mind the historical context. And that context involves the fact that probably all governments in the Western world in the late 18th century were monarchies. Kings and queens ruled. Not only did kings and queens and their families rule, but the kings and queens were understood as being God's representative on earth. And they therefore embodied not just the political power in the country, governmental power, but also the state religion. So the places from where the early colonists came from were monarchies with state religions. And one of the reasons they came, and there are many others as well, but one of the reasons they came is because that didn't sit well with them. And so the American political experiment begins with the Articles of Confederation, as once we're independent of Britain. And after about 8 years of a failed nation state under the Articles, the framers got to work on founding a national government. We'll talk more about this. So, again, the thing to keep in mind, you can read all this verbiage, but the 2 points that I want to make are at the bottom. Political rulers at the time our country was founded were understood not just to be political rulers, but spiritual leaders, religious leaders. And they established a state religion, and people with other faiths were generally persecuted or prosecuted or restricted in their practices, because the king decided what the religion was, and that was that. So it's only in recent centuries that nation-states began to allow freedom of religion in which no specific beliefs or observances were required of the people. So America, United States, and Americans are a people with many religions, but not an established state religion. From my point of view, this is one of the quintessential differences between the United States and the rest of the world, especially the rest of the world at that time. So it was thought at that time that the unity of political authority and religious authority was a matter of course. Of course, this is the way the world was organized. We tried a new political experiment that was unprecedented in American history, and that is to sever the link between political power and religious authority and belief. So, to put this most boldly, and then we'll end here, those who say that the United States was founded as a Christian nation are incorrect. Period. It is true that different religious groups and I don't want to use the word sects, but different colonies had different religious groups that might have been dominant. The most one obvious example was the Quakers in Pennsylvania. But in terms of national government, what is unique at the time and what remains unique about the United States of America is total rejection of religious power and political authority. See you next time.